dive a little bit more deeply into the 7 apostolic priorities that Archbishop Mark outlined for us. And there's a personal response. And God's going to meet us in all of those places as we journey along the way through this summit, through today, through tomorrow, and beyond. So it's a real invitation for us to become the new wineskin, so that the new thing that God is doing in our Archdiocese can be realised in us and through us. Our keynote speaker this morning is here to help us respond to that invitation. And so we have Sherry Weddell. She's the co-founder of the Catherine of Siena Institute, and she currently serves as its co-director. She's developed numerous formation courses and created the first charism discernment process for Catholics. Sherry's the author of Forming Intentional Disciples, which has sold over 100,000 copies. And it's inspired so many parishes and communities across the world. Would you please join me in welcoming Sherry?
Thank you. Thank you very much. I am excited to be here. This is my first time in Brisbane. And so it is, I went and visited St. Stephen's Cathedral yesterday and walked in the footsteps of St. Mary MacKillop, who is one of my heroines, and just was very moved by your beautiful city and all that God is doing here. It is a great privilege for me to have a chance to spend some time with you, and I hope I have a chance to get to talk to some of you and hear your stories and what you're seeing God do. I just wanted to start, I hope, is this a familiar movie? In the United States, everybody sees it every Christmas. A lot of you are familiar with It's a Wonderful Life, the classic black and white, just post-World War II Christmas movie with James Stewart in it. And the story begins, the reason I'm starting with it is because it really depicts the era in which it was made. Because remember how it starts, basically you hear a lot of people praying for a man named George Bailey. You know, oh Lord, help my husband George, you know, and his children are saying, God, please take care of Daddy, and his friends are saying, George is a good guy, help him out, Lord. And you hear them all praying, and then we are catapulted into heaven. You'll see little lights sprinkling, and it's angels talking to each other, and they say, hey, well, we're going to have to do something here. We have to send someone down because a lot of people are praying for a guy named George Bailey. And the other angel says, oh yes, it's his big night. He's about to make a really crucial decision. Who will we send? But what's fascinating for me about that whole scene, that even now in Seattle, I'm from Seattle, Washington, which is famously one of the most secular places in the United States. We're the land of none. And by that we mean like 60% of Seattleites have no religious affiliation of any kind. But yet we watch this movie over and over again with all the assumptions of that scene, that there's a God who is good, who sees everything, who cares about us, who hears our prayers, and the angels serve his good purposes and we can trust them, etc. And that was, in many ways, the world that even here in Australia, as well as in the United States, we knew. Okay, in roughly about 1947, right after the war, when 88% of Australians would have said they were Christian. And there was almost nobody said, I don't believe in anything, or I'm a non-Christian. And that was same was true in the US, exactly the same phenomena. And all those sort of the basic assumptions behind the culture, even if you weren't a Christian, even if you weren't a practicing Christian or not one at all, was this basic Christian idea that the personal God who cared for us, who we could trust, you know, who would come to our aid, etc. Most of us belonged to religious congregations of some kind. We believed in the 10 Commandments. We may not have obeyed them, but we believed in them. You know, we thought they were a good thing. And weekly worship was normal for most people. That was the world we were all, our grandparents were all living in, and great-grandparents. And the values were taken in the culture, And we just took that for granted. That was Christendom circa 1947, okay, right about then. And it was all over the West and Australia and the US. Today we know it's very, very different. We know that actually basically half of that number, about 44% of Australians now say they are Christian. And non-Christians, are 10%, and then nuns are almost 40%, people who have no affiliation of any kind. So we have seen a dramatic change in the climate, in the spiritual culture. I often use my garden at home. I wish I had my pictures here, but I live in the Rocky Mountains. I live 2,000 meters high. That's where my house is, and then there's a mountain that goes another 2,000 meters right above me, okay? And so it's a totally different climate than what I was used to, and rain does not fall from the sky, and all that, but I have a large garden that I had to start from scratch because I bought a fixer-upper, which lots of potential. It had lots of potential, okay? That was about it. And I was starting from scratch. And so almost everything I learned about evangelizing in our culture now, I learned by gardening in an alpine desert. And I learned it's not that you can't have a garden, but you can't do it the way you used to do it when rain fell from the sky on a regular basis, okay? And that's where we are in terms of, it's not that the church cannot flourish here. It's not that we cannot evangelize. It's not that we cannot help each other and our families and our friends encounter Christ in the midst and follow him in the midst of his church, but we can't do it the way we did it in the mid-20th century because we're in a totally different spiritual climate now. And we have to understand the climate we're living in. We know now that many who are raised in religious homes, even Catholic homes, go ahead and leave anyway, okay? And that religious culture, those themes, all the sort of assumptions that were behind It's a Wonderful Life, would people make that movie today? No, not in the same way, because those cultural assumptions are no longer normative. We're living outside of Christendom. I love this picture. This is an image of the early Jesuits in Japan, okay, done by a Japanese artist, showing them ministering in that very different culture. Now we live in a place where institutions are no longer automatically trusted anymore, and not just religious institutions, but any kind of institution. But people, the trust they now give us will be personal. They will trust you. They will trust you. Someone in their life whom they know, who's been good to them, whom they see good in, and they can trust. That will be their bridge of trust now to the church, probably more than to the church itself. It'll be you. And where we can no longer presume that people have what used to be called Christian heads, i.e. they believe in a personal God, the personal God of Christianity. They believe in Jesus Christ. They believe he's the Son of God. They believe he came and suffered and died and rose again. Those were the sort of working assumptions. Christian values, we can't presume any of that anymore. And so that's part of the struggle that we're with. We live in an age where faith is chosen and not inherited. And this is a huge change. And I know it's been very difficult for parents and grandparents and family members to see that no matter how carefully we raise our children, they will choose for themselves. If they choose to stay Catholic and take it seriously and live it, they will have chosen it, not simply inherited it. It doesn't just come from being a member of the tribe anymore, okay? In this culture, young adults feel they choose everything about their life. And that means the faith has to be personally meaningful to each person who chooses. It can't not just simply be, inherited. In order to choose it, they have to find it personally moving, meaningful, touching, relevant, compelling. And that's at the heart of evangelization. We can't just simply invite them back. When I first became Catholic, and I'm not from a Catholic background, as some of you know, I was raised as an evangelical in the United States. But practically the first conversation I had, and here I was a young adult, and I was going like, where is everybody? Meaning, where are my people, right? Where are the other young adults? Because I seemed like I was the youngest person in every room. And I said, okay, well, where is everybody? And the first conversation I had with the priest, he said, oh, they'll be back. I said, okay, tell me how this works. He said, well, yes, they've taken a break while they're, in college and young adult, but they'll come back when they get married and have children. And he was absolutely certain that's the way it was going to work. And I thought, well, he's a priest, he must know. I knew almost nothing, so I figured he must know. But we know that isn't how it works. If it did work at that time, it certainly doesn't work now. And so what motivates people now in 2023, where we are living? The culture is changing so fast. There's basically 3 basic journeys that every person has to make as a Catholic in order to really be and live as a disciple of Jesus Christ in the midst of his church. And the first one, we presume to be baptized as an infant, right? That's where you would start. And then because you were raised by a practicing family who would take you to Mass and make sure you receive the sacraments of initiation and would pray at home with you and tell you stories. And out of that whole experience, you would just pick up the faith, a living faith, as just out of thin air, by watching your family, by the stories you heard, by, see all of that. And it would just communicate to you. And really, in practice, at the parish level, we thought these 2 journeys were enough. You received the sacraments, and you were attending services with your parents and with your family, and out of that would come a lifelong commitment to being a practicing Catholic. The one thing at the parish level we hardly ever talked about was the first journey of the personal sort of journey of that living relationship with Christ and following him as a disciple in the midst of his church. And in the early days, as a Catholic, because I came from a world where that was automatically presumed that's what you were doing, and I was always saying the wrong thing and doing the wrong thing and asking the wrong questions, and people were always looking at me like, what is wrong with you? Why do you keep asking, like, where is Jesus? And why are you using that word at all anyway, the J word, okay? You don't want to use Jesus, because that was Protestant. I was told over and over again I was showing my Protestant roots, because Catholics didn't do that, because that was irreverent. In fact, I actually had a woman in Boston, because I didn't understand why this was, why people were so reluctant to talk about Jesus. And she says, oh, I know where that is. I said, okay, tell me. She says, well, when I was a girl, we were taught that every time you heard Jesus' name, you bowed your head in reverence, right? This was a devotion. And of course, it was to make reparation for all the people who took his name in vain. Understandable, completely. But she says, over time, we never stopped. You can't keep doing this as you go through life, so you just never use the name. And I thought, so let me get it straight. So over time, we forgot about the person whose name we're not mentioning out of reverence? Yeah. No, but it was not intended, of course. It was absolutely intended as an act of reverence, but it had an unintended impact over generations when the children and grandchildren of these people never heard the name used. One of my friends used to say, he says, we treat Jesus like he's Voldemort in a Harry Potter film. He who must not be named. Okay? Now, thank God that I have seen that change dramatically in the United States and in many other parts of the West in the last 10 years. And now we're talking about Jesus. But the awareness of that central relationship that everything else we do as Catholics is supposed to be an expression of and the fruit of, that is now becoming also visible to a lot of us. But in the past, the world I entered, we thought if your bum was in the pew, you were good. especially if you put money in the plate. That was double good, okay? Right? Now, you might mentally be thinking, how long do I have to do this? You could be sitting there every weekend going, oh, are there any alternatives out there? How long do I have to do this? I'm thinking about leaving. We know many Catholics think about leaving a long time before they do, years. But they could be still sitting in the same spot at the parish that they were there every week, and we think everything's fine, having no idea what's going on in their hearts and minds. All three journeys are crucial now in the 21st century. There is no doing without the first journey. Not outside of Christendom. In Christendom, you could just kind of ride the cultural flow. You just went with the flow. But when now the cultural flow is against us, you just can't, just float along. You have to want it. You have to choose it. It has to be rooted in the living Lord, who is the center and the heart of our church, our worship. People ask me why I became Catholic. I said I did it to follow Jesus. I wanted to be where his redemptive work was the center of worship, and I wanted to be in the center of his body on earth and not on the periphery. And that's what we're talking about. He is the center. And that, if we don't have now, in 2023, if we don't have that first journey, people will no longer attend. A lot of the people across the world, because after COVID, everybody's finding out how many are coming back, aren't they? We're all finding this out. And it looks different in different places. It's different in different parishes. But a lot of people who were more or less regular Mass attenders have not come back. Because it was something else. It was culture. It was attachment, to people. It was just habit. But it wasn't deep enough to survive 2 years of pandemic and closure. And what will happen is not only will they leave if they don't have that relationship with Christ, but they will not be baptizing their children. We are at the very, very end of, we will just automatically baptize our children. In the United States, we're seeing baptismal rates for infants just plummet. So even baptizing your child will now be chosen based on whether or not the faith is deeply meaningful to you. All those things that we presumed would automatically happen are off the table now, because that we live in this very, very different world. We have to make all three journeys. We talk about a very simple stages of Christian development, okay? Seeker, disciple, apostle. And we just started doing this in the early days because we discovered a lot of Catholics had no vision for the growth of an average Catholic, of a normal lay person in an average parish, and what maturation would look like. So we started talking about seeker, disciple, apostle. It's very simple. Seeker is just that whole journey from maybe I don't even believe in a God of any kind, to the point, that's a long journey, to the point where I have just begun to try to follow Jesus as his disciple in the midst of his church. And that's the seeker journey, the first journey. That's what the Catechism says is the first and fundamental journey. And then the second conversion, that is the life of discipleship through which we continue to be transformed, of course, as we walk with Jesus. It's lifelong. It's that lifelong transformation. And when we follow him as a disciple, then he can send us on his behalf to take part in his mission to other people, to be an instrument of his love and his mercy and his beauty and his truth and his healing and his provision for other people in ways that change lives. If there's one thing I could say to you, it would be this: there is someone out there who is waiting for what you have been given to give, and their life literally hangs in the balance. And I am not being melodramatic. It matters that you say yes. There are people out there you haven't met yet, people who may not even have been born yet, but in God's providence, you are the one who has been called, who has been anointed, who has been gifted to be the God's part of God's provision and God's answer for that person, that family, that neighborhood, that city, that parish, that profession, that circle of friends. And it matters that you say yes. And the only way we can say that yes is if we are open to the graces that the Lord is pouring out upon us, and we are saying yes to them on a regular basis. Sometimes I talk about this and use different images. I start with the seeker as sort of in spiritual infancy. And I was doing this with a bunch of priests in the UK, and one of them turned out to be the pastor of Oxford, the parish in Oxford. And I'm like, oh, wow. He turns to me and says, are you trying to tell me that my sophisticated, educated, brilliant parishioners are spiritual infants? And fortunately, I didn't have to say anything because his brothers all turned on him and said, oh, George, get a grip, of course. I said, my work here is done, I'm out of here. They knew. Of course, yes, a lot of us in this room, we can be massively sophisticated. We can be geniuses in certain areas of life. Brilliant, educated, cultured, sophisticated. And then there's other areas of our life where there's a big hole. I mean, we're used to that. Most of us know we have areas where we're weak and areas where we're strong. Yes, we can be all those things and be spiritual infants. A lot, in our experience at this point, and we've worked with at least in about 240 dioceses all over the world, and directly with at least 240,000 Catholics face-to-face, over the last 25 years, and heard their stories. In our experience to this point, the majority of our people, even our practicing Catholics, are still seekers. They're still in those early stages and essentially are spiritual infants. Now, in this schema, you can think of discipleship as sort of like, well, the difference between a newborn and a 10-year-old. I mean, how different is that? Think of when adult parents say, my child is growing up so fast, I miss them the way they were when they were younger and all of this, Because at age 10, it's a totally different universe. They're marching out to school in the morning on their own. They dress themselves. They spend the whole day outside your grasp, outside your supervision. They've got their own circle of friends. They're providing leadership among their friends. They're involved in all this independent stuff. They have their own opinions, and they're really happy to tell you about them, and why you're wrong and all that stuff. Yeah, because they're becoming their own people. They have their own attitudes, their own understandings. Are they adults yet? Of course not. But they're miles away from an infant. But our goal, here's the deal. The church flourishes in every generation depending on the percentage of her people who become full-grown Christian adults, who are now not only capable of taking full responsibility for their own lives, but raising up and the next generation and pouring out their lives for many others. They're generative, and they become a man or a woman for others. And the church, how she flourishes in any generation, in any cultural setting, depends on the percentage of her people who become full-grown Christian adults as opposed to babies. Some of us may feel that we're one of 3 or 4 adults frantically running around caring for hundreds of babies. But that is not normal. It's not the way it's supposed to be. Obviously, if this was happening in Brisbane, if our children, our infants were not growing up, it'd be a state of chaos, an emergency everywhere. People would be incredibly anxious. if 1-year-olds weren't beginning to crawl and beginning to walk and beginning to talk, and if at 5 they still weren't doing that, it would be an absolute emergency. But in spiritual terms, we've gotten used to most of our people staying spiritual infants. But that is not what Jesus Christ lived and died for and rose again for. And that is not why he is among us now. Our people are our riches. Outside of Christendom, it's not our buildings. And you've got beautiful buildings here. And I loved visiting St. Stephen's Cathedral and, that whole area. I've got pictures. I put it online on Facebook. All my friends are going, whoa, it's so beautiful. But that is not what is sustaining us now. Outside of Christendom, it is the grace of God received in and cooperated by and transforming our people that changes everything. That's when the church outside of Christendom flourishes. Our people are our pillars now. And if we make disciples of our people and help them grow into mature apostles, they will take care of our institutions. We won't have to worry about them, and they're going to create stuff we haven't even thought of. Because the level of creativity that is unleashed by spiritual maturity is staggering. They're going to do stuff we've never dreamed of. God will call them and gift them to that. But our challenges, most of our challenges, we say we have how questions, but the answers are who answers. The answers are the people that God is calling up, raising up, that we are seeing emerge in our midst. The disciples and apostles who will change the course of history, who will be obedient, open, receptive to all the graces of God, and through whom he will change the course of history. Now, just quickly, disciples. This stage is very interesting. This is where people feel comfortable going public with their faith in hostile or in different environments. This is the stage at which typically, a year or two into it, the charisms begin to manifest. And I have a session this afternoon about charisms. We'll go into detail there. But we've heard this many, many, many times from people. They'll say, I went through this retreat, 3 years ago, and I had this amazing experience of God, and everything changed, and I took my faith seriously. I went back to church, and then about a year or so later, this thing showed up. What is this thing? And I say, tell me a story. Tell me what you're seeing. And so often, it turns out to be the emergence of a charism in their lives. Because one of the primary times they emerge in our life is after the point when our faith has become personal and we are now seeking to be obedient to the call of God. And then those charisms manifest. And one of the things that has been so amazing to see is that when people discern charisms, the whole idea that I am being sent by Christ suddenly comes to life. For the average Catholic in the average parish, this was just outside their frame of reference. But what they've told us over and over again is, I used to think one woman, she said it this way, she said, I used to think I was unworthy to kiss the sandals of Jesus. But now you tell me that I stand in his place with my daughter and my friends and my coworkers. And in a sense, I put on the sandals and I walk like they fit. She said, this is revolutionary. This changes everything. My relationship with the church, my relationship with God, my relationship with my friends and my family. Because it suddenly dawned that she was not just the recipient of the ministry of others, that she herself was an anointed one, an apostle, a sent one by Jesus Christ himself through baptism in her own right. And now that had become living. It wasn't just an abstraction. This was like a real thing that had become living for her, that a call she really had to answer, that she really had to grapple with. And it just changes people's lives so tremendously. At that stage, when people begin to grapple with God's call in their life very seriously, to follow Jesus, that's what we talk about, moving from disciple into apostle. It's a developmental stage. All of a sudden, you have a sense of personal responsibility for the mission of Christ in the world. Not all of it, of course, but just your little piece of it. For the mission of the church, you have a sense of responsibility for the mission of the church. And you know you have actually been anointed and actually been gifted and actually been sent to undertake something really crucial for the good of the whole. Crucial to the redemptive work of Christ in the world. And that transformation in identity is so amazing. I've heard so many of these stories, and you just find yourself tearing up to see ordinary, regular Catholics in the pews. They're not in ministry. They don't travel and do workshops. They're not priests. They're not religious. They're just regular people. But they know. They sense God is calling them, and it really matters that they say yes. And this is the stage where people discern personal vocations of all kind, priestly, religious, lay, secular vocations of all kinds, not just states of life, but all kinds of personal calls. This is the stage at which people start bearing really abundant fruit. Fruit that lasts, fruit that changes the course of history. And I'll be telling a few stories. I've got so many of them. This is the stage at which people become the great evangelizers of people, families, institutions, cultures, where they become the great, apostles of justice and mercy. And this enormous creativity is unleashed. Dorothy Sayers put it this way. She said, the difference between a saint and ordinary people is not that saints do things ordinary people neglect. She says, the things saints do have not occurred to ordinary people at all. Because grace is like the work of an artist. It is not a choice between alternatives. It is the creation of something new. And in all the generations in the church, and every time of revival, there have been an emergence of a number of people, of apostles, whom God gifts with this apostolic creativity and hope and great joy and generosity that is so compelling to the people around them, and out of which they give birth to things that change the course of history. My best guess, this is a US figure. I'm sure it's different in Australia. My best guess in the US is that maybe 1% of Catholics in the US are at this level of spiritual development. I have no idea here or other countries. I don't have that kind of experience. But it isn't a majority. Think of how different, even if it was 5% or 10%, we would hardly recognize ourselves because of the joy and the creativity and the prayer and the fruit that would just start bubbling out and changing our life, all of us inside the church, as well as touching the lives of many people outside. One true story, great, I love this one. This is a young woman, 13 years old, in California, raised no background at all, no religious background. But she got to know a guy at school that she really liked. And so one day out of the blue, though, he turned to her and he said, "What church do you go to?" Maybe they don't do that in Australia, but they do that in the US. Okay. And she goes, so she's thinking really hard because she has nothing to pull on and she wants to impress him. But then she remembered she had a grandmother who was Catholic. She said, "Oh, I'm Catholic." He said, "Great, so am I." Now she's really, really stuck because now she has to fake it. So she ran home, got her grandmother on the line. She said, "Grandma, tell me everything you know about being Catholic." Grandma didn't know anything, apparently, because she wasn't a practicing Catholic. Okay, so she just said, "I don't know, you know." So she's still stuck. But her new friend invited her to Mass with him and his parents. And so she goes, Okay, sure. So now she's going to go in, never having crossed the threshold of a church of any kind before, and pretend she knows what to do at Mass. But she said when she was there, she said, I felt like this presence there. She said, I didn't know, I wouldn't have called it God exactly, but I knew it was there. And she said, they were talking about God and his love, and I loved the music. She was really drawn in. So she got involved with the youth ministry without telling anyone that she wasn't A, Catholic, B, baptized, or had any Christian background of any kind. Okay. For a year and a half, she faked it. Okay, so you got to give her credit. She is creative. All right. And a year and a half in at a youth, basically a retreat, she finally broke down and confessed to the team what was really going on. And they were super supportive. And they said, fine, well, and they got her immediately signed up for like a 2-year RCIA program. Okay. Here she is. She's 15 years old, and she's now in RCIA. But her love of Jesus was outpacing her sacramental status. She was praying every day. She was reading scripture. She fell in love with him. She was, in her heart and mind, she was already a disciple before she was baptized. Which is okay, because that's exactly what the church says is supposed to be the normal state of an adult being baptized. So she was baptized, and then almost immediately she discerned a charism of mercy, and she and a friend went out on their own, not just with the parish, on their own initiative to start working with the poor in her neighborhood. And by the time she was 17 and a senior in high school, she was discerning religious life. At 13, she was below 0, and at 17, she was an emerging apostle. Now, she was open, of course, exceptionally so. But that parish knew how to walk with her, because they had done this with many other people. They recognized what God was doing in her life. They knew how to companion her and accompany her and help her make these transitions. It doesn't have to be glacial. It can be incredibly fast if you and I are disciples and we are ready to help somebody else make that journey. We know right now that only about 30%, now this is US figures, and it's a study that just came out, so I don't know exactly what the numbers would be here, but it's going to be roughly the same across the West as far as I can tell. Only 30% of young adults in the US now believe in a God, the personal God, who will hear your prayers, care about you, and intervene in your life in response to your prayers, i.e., only 30% believe in the prayers for George Bailey. They don't think that God exists. And yet, we know that is fascinating. 75% of adults who believe in that God attend services on a regular basis. And 75% of those who don't believe in that God seldom or never show up. That is the turning point now. It's no longer, it's below being explicitly Christian. It's just, do you believe in the basic God of the Judeo-Christian scriptures? The God who loves us, cares for us, who's all-loving, all-knowing, and all-powerful. To the point where I could pray that God would hear me and intervene in my life to help me. That's the turning point for many, many people now. And for many Catholics, even practicing Catholics, that's where they are. This Canadian study really speaks to that. They said they looked at children who are raised as Christians, mainline Christians, evangelical Protestants, and Catholics. They were raised in the tradition. What were they? What religious identity did they have at age 23 as emerging adults? 4 factors made the difference. 1, they had experienced God's presence and they had seen answered prayer. So you can hear that already. They had somehow knew that God, the God of George Bailey and his friends, and It's a Wonderful Life, existed. They had experienced it. They knew that God was there, that God was answering them. They had a chance to talk about their own real spiritual issues inside the Christian community. They don't have to leave. They had a chance to really hear in depth and wrestle with the kerygma, the great story of Jesus, of his incarnation, his life, his miracles, his teachings, his suffering, death, resurrection, ascension, the whole drama that is the heart and the center of everything for us. They had heard it as a story many times, had a chance to wrestle with it. Did they believe it? What did it mean? And what were they going to do about it? How were they going to respond to Christ? And the fourth thing was they had other people, older adults in their lives, like you or me. And it could be family. It could be parents. It could be grandparents, extended family. But it could be other people too. Friends, mentors, youth ministers, pastors, neighbors who were living the faith. They saw a compelling model in us of Christian faith lived that had deep meaning and power and joy and hope. If these four things were true, they were here and believing. They emerged as young adults, as deeply believing young adults, practicing. And if it was not true, they were gone. Because what they want to know is this is real, this is true, and people I know and people I trust know it is and are living that. That's what moves people now. So what they are looking for is this. Is there really, really a God who is with us? We need to help them. The first task of evangelization now, we can't take this for granted. We have to help them become open just to the possibility that there is a God who sees them, cares about you, hears you, responds to you, and will answer your prayers. Because that question is what Tim Keller, who basically is a church planter in Manhattan and is very famous for his effectiveness in reaching young adults. He says, we used to presume they had Christian heads. This is Christian head. This is what a Christian head looks like. The belief in that personal God. We used to believe we could presume that was there, and we wanted to give them Christian hearts. We wanted to ask them to say yes to living and committing themselves to the whole life of faith that God asked of us. But they don't have those Christian heads anymore for the most part. And that is where our challenge is in evangelization now. One of the issues, and I love to do this in groups, I wish I had time to do it here, just a group of regular people, Catholics, and I'll say, okay, where's Jesus right now and what is he doing? And we just open it up. Oh, it's fascinating. The answers or the non-answers are really stunning. But everybody will say, the first thing Americans say, they'll say, he's living in my heart. I said, okay, he's living in your heart, great. And? What do you mean, and? He's in my heart. And? Oh, he's with us when we're together, gathered. Yes, excellent. And? What do you mean, and? Well, when I read scripture, I encounter him. Yeah, and? Because the church actually lists about 24 different ways that Jesus is present, actively present right now in our lives. And as John Paul II said, contemplation is the ability to recognize and rejoice in and respond to all those presences. Because he's not just occasionally present, he's constantly present in all these amazing ways. And he's active right now. This is important. I just throw this up because this just came out literally hours before I got on the plane to come here. But a UK study came out and said that only 13% of teens in the UK believe that Jesus is currently active right now. I have no idea what the numbers would be in Australia or in the US. But in other words, they don't believe in that God. They really don't. And they like Jesus. Everybody likes him. But they may not believe he's present. They don't believe he's active. He has nothing to offer them. I'm kind of running out of time here. I just want to talk about one more thing. We know, he is present spiritually, he is present in the Eucharist, in these living and powerful ways, and he is actively present. His humanity, his glorified humanity, is still the center of redemption and salvation now. Sometimes my friends and I joke because we've heard a lot of people who talk about Jesus like he's on vacation. You know what I mean? Like I had 3 priests in a row 3 weeks in a row at Mass use the phrase, when Jesus was on earth. When you hear that, what do you think? When Jesus was on earth? Is he here? No, he's gone. And one of them really got eloquent. He decided to unpack that a little bit. He said, here's how it works. He said, yes, he came and he died and he rose again and he went to heaven and he left us his marching orders, and now we're alone and it's up to us. Yeah, exactly. And of course, I'm like mentally saying, could you just turn, this is the moment to turn to the tabernacle, which is like 7 feet to the right and just behind you, and just gracefully say, but of course. But strangely enough, he didn't take my telegram. The living Lord, you and I know this. You and I are living this. But how intentionally are we living it? How often do we open ourselves intentionally? The papal theologian has a book out, a wonderful book called The Act of Faith, but he basically says this. He says, at every moment, there is an ocean of God's grace and God's mercy and God's power is being poured out on all of us. There's no such thing as a God-forsaken person or a God-forsaken place. It is literally impossible for any person, no matter how adamant an atheist they are, to ever be outside the contact of Jesus' saving power. Every single person we encounter, he is in touch with them. The question is, how much you and I receive of the graces he is pouring out is dependent on our openness, on our making that, anytime we turn to him, direct an act of faith toward him, that lowers a barrier that our indifference or our fear or our disbelief sets up. And we lower that barrier, and then he pours his graces on us. We may not feel it. This is not something we necessarily feel, but it is happening all the time. And it is something we can experience throughout the day in every part of our lives, to the extent that we are open and aware and saying, Lord, I am open now. Lord, help me receive what you want to give me now. Help me say yes now. As we do that, we ourselves will mature into those apostles whom God can use to change the course of church history and of the history of the world. We will be that person who will have the gift to offer the person who needs that. We will be the one who's been prepared, who's been gifted, who's been sent to that person, and the fruit we bear will be the answer to their prayers. That's what's at stake here. I'm afraid I've gone over a little tiny bit. I just want to take a moment. Let's just, in silence, what is it that God is asking? What new thing is he asking of you now? There's a reason you're here. What new door is he asking you to open? What new yes is he asking you to give? Theologians say that every time we say, give a yes, the whole Trinity rejoices. Our simplest act of faith opens the door so we receive those graces, and it brings joy to the Father and the Son and the Holy Spirit together. What is the door he's asking you to open right now, this weekend? What is the yes he is asking you to give? Holy One, I thank you for all that you are doing here among these wonderful people who you have called together in this place and in this community and in this diocese. I ask a special, new, powerful pouring out of your graces this weekend, and that many of us would say, here I am, Lord, send me. I want to open myself to all that you desire to give me. I want it all. We ask it all in the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Thank you all very much.